It's a real pleasure to be here, and this is my third trip to Latvia, and on the two occasions before I was working with the Centre Marta, so it's a pleasure to see you again, and I've seen you around at different events since. I think when we're talking about the issue of violence against women, and the perspective I'm putting is about human trafficking, as we heard this morning from the British ambassador and the Irish ambassador, there's no room for slapping our backs, really. There's no room to say we're doing a good job, because actually the situation is not really improving, albeit that we may now see that there's signs of improvement. But if we look across the world, there's 13 international conventions and instruments to end violence against women and girls. And of course the Beijing Plus 30 is happening this year at the United Nations at the Commission of the Status of Women. And we need to see how far and how much progress has been made in 30 years. And if we think about that number, how much progress has been made in the private industry? How much progress has there been in technology in 30 years? But this issue about how we have equality for women and girls, how we protect people from domestic violence and gender-based violence, we haven't made progress at the same pace. And we have to look at why that is. So when we look at this issue, we need to look at where does it happen? And we know it can happen in the most wealthy of households, it can happen in social housing, it can happen in places like brothels, and it happens in the workplace, it happens in sports working environments, it happens in all parts of the world. And as we heard this morning, people prey on this. It's their lives to be perpetrators, and victims are left vulnerable, often without support. But when it comes to human trafficking, there are 50 million people worldwide who are victims of human trafficking, and about 78% are known to be women and girls. 1 in 4 of those victims is a child, and 22,000 children die every year in exploitative and poor labour conditions. That's the ones that are known of. And all of this generates $236 billion annually in criminal profit. 22,000 children is like 110 Boeing 737s crashing in a year. We know what happened when 2 Boeing 737s crashed. Quite rightly, the aircrafts were all grounded for over 2 years. The chief executive officer lost his job. A criminal investigation, litigation. But we've got 22,000 children that die in exploitative conditions. Nobody's lost their job. Nothing happens. And that's because these are vulnerable people who don't have the same rights as we do. And all the commitments that we've made, whether it's at the UN, the EU, the Council of Europe, and domestically, are about giving people the same rights. The Sustainable Development Goals are about leaving no one behind, but we still do it. And if we take a look at the fact that, the numbers that are published by the US State Department, there are 50 million victims of trafficking every year. Well, if we look at 2022, there were 5,577 convictions, and in 2023, 7,100, which amounts to 1 conviction for every 7,000 victims. Hardly a statistic that can be measured. So when we look at all this, things aren't going very well, and we have to accept that before we can acknowledge change. So if we look at the real issues around
complexity, structural barriers, skepticism, injustice and discrimination. In the EU, 1 in 3 women have experienced physical and/or sexual violence. 1 in 2 have experienced sexual harassment. and more than 1 in 2 young women worldwide are affected by cyberviolence. Enough. The EU is taking action to end violence against women and domestic violence in Europe. The EU wants to ensure better protection of women online and offline, including by criminalizing cyberviolence. Better access to justice, including easier ways to report violence. Better support to survivors, such as sexual violence referral centres, specialised shelters for victims, an EU-wide helpline number. Training of professionals and awareness raising to stop violence from happening in the first place. Let's act now to stop violence against women.
So that's the issue and what we've committed to from the EU, what the EU is committed to, and that is replicated in the UK. But is what's happening really proving that? We hear some of the great work that is going on at the front line, but how well resourced is it? How well funded is it? What is the political will? What is being put into that compared to other things that are government priorities? For example, trade, commerce, business. What is happening on this agenda? When we look at those figures, we're talking about 1 in 2 women or girls experiencing some form of sexual violence. Yet, investment and cultural change remains low. So, in the UK, there has been some changes, and I think these are reflected around a number of countries. Harassment legislation, coercive behaviour legislation, victims of crime legislation, which brings in all areas of government. Modern slavery legislation, which brings in things like the victims entitled to reparation, special procedures at courts, etc. Positive duties to report crimes against children. Strategies to improve the status of women, which includes the pay gap, sport, health, technology, and women in decision-making roles. And then we have things, the Victims Commissioner, the Children's Commissioner, the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and a new role that's coming out of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. Those are all things that are happening in the UK. And very often when I hear and people say, well, we don't need an Anti-Slavery Commissioner, we do it okay. Our rapporteur's in the police. I was a police officer for 30 years. I would never suggest a rapporteur is in the police or in the government. A rapporteur, as has happened in the UK, was independent, and now in Ireland is sat within the Institute, the Irish Institute for Human Rights. And so it does an independent review on progress. And we don't like getting criticised, but we have to accept it. We have to look at ourselves and say, are we doing the right things? Particularly if we're in statutory positions, because we work for the public, not the other way around. And so the UK legislation and policy more recently, and particularly in the last year, after the case in particular that you heard the British Deputy Ambassador talking about in respect of a woman being murdered by a police officer, that man slipped through the net. The vetting should have identified him. He was in a very high-profile job on firearms, protecting sometimes VIPs. How did he get through the net? What happened? And of course, there's not just something that happens overnight. There were red flags all the way through his experience within the police. And the police in the UK are quite proactive, and if you commit offences or misappropriate behaviour when it's sexually related in the police, you will get sacked. In fact, most of the time, as has happened on a number of occasions, you'll be charged with offence called misconduct in public office, which holds life imprisonment, and you will end up getting a minimum of probably 4 or 5 years. For example, having sex with a victim of crime, or having sex with a victim who comes in to report a crime or a witness. It's looked upon very gravely in the UK. But with all the legislation I've talked about, one thing that was seen was that there wasn't enough being done at the front line. There is a Victims of Crime Act, but a new one has just been passed by the government. And what this is about is going to the front line and working with law enforcement, the local authorities, the healthcare service and civil society to come up with plans that are funded plans that will work to change the rhetoric, so that we got these at a local level, but these should be feeding into the intelligence system so that we can identify early those red flags and also the organised crime groups. But that needs a plan. It can't be just things happening in isolation. As good as those things may be, it has to be connected to a plan. Many crimes happen in isolation, but they show how somebody moves on to commit murders, or they move on to commit domestic violence routinely. And with domestic violence, we have a zero tolerance. We don't stop it and say, well, he was hitting her once a month, or he was hitting her every night, now it's once a month, so it's okay, we've reduced it. But we don't really play that out in reality. We don't have this severe approach to domestic violence and abuse that we should have. And some of the processes in the UK are trying to change that. In the UK, there's a process for taking evidence, and this is the strategy, which is quite a long document, called Achieving Best Evidence in Criminal Proceedings. It's produced by the Ministry of Justice and the National Police Chiefs Council. And in that document, it tells the police about what they have to do, what they should do, and the way that victims should be interviewed, special measures that are entitled to victims at court, and things that they have to do. And all through these documents, it talks about relationships with civil society, about relationships with local partners, and how you can get better responses and better outcomes if you work with your communities, even on some of the most serious of cases. So this is a guidance for police, and some of it is mandatory and has to be followed. So the interviews is an important thing. And with interviews, you can make a promise to victims at the outset. And there are two things within the legislation. You have a vulnerable witness and an intimidated witness. And the reason the term witness is used is because it doesn't just apply to victims, it applies to witnesses as well. And that translates then into a code of practice, which is mandatory. And victims can appeal against, witnesses can appeal against, but it's not so mandatory. But in the vulnerability, these are circumstances where someone is vulnerable. So is entitled to certain measures at court, is entitled to be interviewed by video. And then intimidated, as you can see there, includes all victims of sexual offences and includes victims of modern slavery and others that you can come to a decision that they are intimidated. But then it's mandatory that they get these protections in the court system, from the police, under the Victims of Crime Act. So these are not optionals that can come in at some point. This is mandatory. And so this has been in place for some time, but as we see, and as I said, sometimes things still slip through the net. So what is available to protect witnesses at the courts? Well, there are a number of measures. For example, a victim may never ever have to step in the courtroom. Their video can be used evidence in chief. It can also be used in cross-examination for children, always, and now that's being moved up to adults as well. So the cross-examination is conducted by the defence with the judge. The jury won't be there. The jury will see it later. So the victim never steps foot in the courtroom, never has to give testimony live. It's all recorded. And you will hear countries say, well, our constitution wouldn't allow that. Well, then you need to change your constitution. That is one of the things that we hear all the time. Constitutionally, that's not allowed. Well, you know, constitutionally, in some parts of the world, it's still you're still allowed to have women not driving cars, or you can stone them because they have a relationship out of marriage. Well, we don't want those constitutions. So we need brave leaders who are going to challenge these and realise this may take some time. So these special measures give confidence to victims. But what also has to happen is there has to be access, not through the statutory agencies. So there is Refuge, which operates across the UK, which has a helpline and many, many facilities for accommodation for victims of domestic abuse and violence. And they can ring up and they can get accommodation within hours. And then all the processes around gathering evidence, around contacting the police if that's what the victim wants, can be carried out in slow time. And this system works. It's actually funded by the government for the phone line and for a lot of the accommodation. But we have what's called police and crime commissioners in the UK, which are local chiefs who are elected of the police, and they fund these processes at all as well. But it still doesn't mean that conviction rates are high. It still doesn't mean that reporting rates are as high as they should be. As we heard earlier, only 1 in 8 report to the police. But what we have found with refuge is where the people that come forward and the women who come forward historically may not have engaged with law enforcement, now they will. Sometimes it's on intelligence basis, sometimes it's because they want to go to court, sometimes it's because they want to know their options. But what has moved on from there then? Well, there is what's called a protection, a domestic abuse protection notice. This is new and is only being trialled at the moment. But this is new to legislation in the UK. And what it allows the police to do is when they get that call at 3 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, a police officer of a certain rank can authorise that this person, who is the alleged offender, even when the victim doesn't want to know, is subject to certain conditions. Those conditions can include not going somewhere, and that can be quite a large radius. It can mean they cannot use the bank. There can be all sorts of conditions that can be put in place, and this can be done by police immediately, not waiting for a court to make a decision, not waiting for the woman to be a victim again or the person who is being abused, but it can be done there and then. But then you may want a longer term solution, and then there's what's called domestic abuse protection orders, which are issued by the courts. These have much more power, and these include things like being able to put devices onto people to track them, putting conditions that they may have to report to the police station every day at certain times. If the violence in that is pretty serious, it can be several times a day. Not going to a public house, not consuming alcohol. And if they breach those orders, you don't have to have the victim come and give the evidence. They are arrested and charged with breaching the order. So they go before the courts for that, which has no impact on the victim. But of course the victim has to be told and informed. So these measures are about changing a culture, but putting immediate responses in quickly so that you can take away the risk as much as you can. It also makes out that there is a proactive approach by law enforcement and not reactive. And these apply similarly to modern slavery and human trafficking, where there are risk orders and prevention orders available, which can be before offending takes place. So if there's intelligence that someone is going to traffic people, or there's evidence that they've trafficked before in another jurisdiction, you can get these orders. Again, in urgent circumstances, the police can authorise these, and then they can be extended by the courts. Post-conviction, they are generally mandatory, so that someone has an order when they are released from prison to have certain conditions around them. But when we look at things like online and digital, and we've heard how many women are subject to digital crimes, well, that needs to be governed by law. We hear about freedom of speech, we hear all these excuses, and the US has got some strange legislation about protecting online platforms. But what's happened in the UK is they brought in the Online Safety Act. But what this does, it doesn't place the burden on the police. What it does, Ofcom, which is the Office of Communications, that would look at adverts, etc., they monitor it. And if they see adverts that are done in an illegal way, they can then do a series of things. They can tell them to take them down. They can tell them that they're committing breaches. They can fine them, very large fines, up to 18 million or 10% of their turnover. Or they can say those platforms are banned from advertising anything in the UK. Therefore, the purpose of their platform of making money goes. This isn't put on the police. This is a regulatory process, a civil process, as prevention. and it can wipe out sites that are advertising children or abusing children in a moment. And we need to get more processes like this that aren't about one investigation, about looking at one case, that go to systemic approaches to prevent exploitation and violence and activities that have been making people large sums of money. And one of the things I say when people say, well, you know, the internet should be a free space. Well, we need to have laws like we have out in our streets. And if somebody was walking around any town centre and said, I want children to exploit, the police would be called and they'd be arrested. Yet these online sites go into children's bedrooms day after day after day and find ways to get in there and use their advertising and their platforms that end up with children being abused, children being subject to violence, women being subject to violence, and ultimately some people losing their lives. So we have to be robust. And then if we look at the responding to domestic abuse, as I said, there are policies that are much wider. Policies, for example, the Department of Health and their role. And this is replicated across other parts, Department of Education. And then this will all sit under the new Domestic Commissioner of Domestic Abuse and Gender-Based Violence, so that we can start looking at these things collectively and not in isolation. It's crucial that we're not looking at one part. And also, as the police, we shouldn't be saying, well, we want that bit of intelligence there because it's easy. It helps us track the people down. Well, in policing terms, if there was someone advertising drug dealers, we wouldn't say, let's leave that platform there because it's easier for us to find the drug dealers. We'd use that platform to take them out because they're doing money laundering, they're doing organised crime, and they're a vehicle for the people up the road. We need to look at every single part, not choosing what's the easy option. And that sometimes can be difficult as a police officer, particularly when you're looking at KPIs or key performance indicators and figures. Well, actually, sometimes it's the quality that you need to look at. So all these policies need to come together to lead an investigation process. And I will give you a quick overview of a case that came in the UK. We got intelligence from the National Health Service that a woman had been brought into a hospital and was believed to be the subject. She had been raped, but they thought, because a nurse had had some training, that it was more like trafficking. So the victim was then taken to an ABE suite. You wouldn't have anybody there in uniform, that's just a picture. But that is an ABE suite, which would be in a normal sort of premises, not a police station. It would have somewhere to make tea. It would have a children's room there. So the interview would be taken in there, very, very relaxed way, under ABE rules, achieving best evidence, which is about a cognitive interview. There'll be cameras in that room. The victim will it will all be explained. There's no surprises, and it goes at the pace of the victim. These can sometimes take 2 weeks. And I'm sure other officers in the room know that. Then what happens is that we then look at the phone of the victim and other data. And you're looking for all sorts of data, CCTV, opportunities to find evidence, local travel, accommodation. And then when you get that little bit of information, you start looking at that and start plotting it. And on this case, we soon were able to track where aircraft were being booked all over the country and all over Europe. We were also then able to track where the money was. We were then able to track where the phones were being used and cars were travelling, and the picture became very clear that this was not just one case of an isolated, albeit very serious rape. This was an organised crime group operating, earning hundreds of thousands and millions a year. So that operation was put together using a joint investigation team immediately. When I turned up in The Hague, I was told it would, before I went, it would take months to get a joint investigation team. I turned up there, I said, I want one, and we need it quickly. 2 weeks, we had the joint investigation team up. And then we did our mutual letters of request immediately, not waiting, because we knew money was going to India. So that resulted in a very large organised crime group being arrested within a month of us getting that information. So I don't buy it when I hear these investigations take years. Sometimes they do, but it depends how much effort you put in and how much you're willing to push the system. People haven't got the time to wait. Every day means another victim, another rape, another crisis for somebody. So we need to speed it up, just like we would on a murder or a terrorism or any other serious crime. So, of course, one of the important things is using covert deployments. I know some parts of the world they're used regularly. In our part of the world, they're used less frequently. But it's important to see this as a serious crime because there are so many technical ways of gathering evidence. So on that case I showed you there, we had no victim to go to the charging point. But the Crown Prosecution Service said, with all the evidence you've got and the circumstantial evidence, we will charge with human trafficking and domestic violence, and and violence and assaults and so forth. And I think back to when I was investigating murders 20 or so years ago. I remember the first times that we were convicted people for murder without a body. People would say, you'll never get a conviction without a body, but we did. And on this case, we got the charges. And actually what happened was more victims came out because they realised we were serious. And in the end, some people pleaded guilty and some went to trial, and the main perpetrators got 16 years imprisonment. So what we need is a cross-government inclusive strategy and action plan. That is crucial. Without that, nothing's going to happen. But also with that, you need the funding, you need the political will, and you need the understanding. And just to finalise, last week I was at the G20 in Rio. Of course, Latvia is not a G20 on its own, Ireland is not a G20 on its own, the UK is, but they are part of the EU, which are G20 countries, is a G20 member. And I've started raising 30 billion by 2030 to make sure that the SDGs are delivered on the facts of human trafficking and the violence. And that's getting support of many of the G20 countries. And that's 30 billion a year. People say, where's that money going to come from? Well, find the 236 billion that's floating around made out of this, and you've got most of it back. But also, the US spends 100 billion a year alone on drugs, fighting drugs. Last year it spent 258 million on trafficking. So 258 million against 100 billion. So it shows this is a poor relation as a crime. Sounds complex, but I think we need to connect, we need to cooperate, we need to all understand each other's role and respect each other's role. But when people say it's too hard, I always think of Nelson Mandela, who said it always seems impossible until it's done. Thank you very much.
Tiešām brīnišķīgi.